Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wylodean Saxon Lecture. This lecture series is funded through a generous gift from the late Bill Saxon, an OU alumnus in memory of his wife, Wylodean Saxon, who died in October 2003. At OU, Mr. Saxon advanced the arts and culture of Oklahoma through his support of OU's two major museums, the Sam Noble Oklahoma Museum of Natural History and, of course, the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. Here at the Fred Jones, he created the Wylodean Saxon Memorial Lecture Series in honor of his late wife to bring distinguished artists, collectors, and authors to the state to share their expertise with Oklahomans. This lecture series is a reflection of his late wife's passion for art and art history and her leadership as a member of the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art Board of Visitors. I want to say that we're very pleased to have members of the Saxon family here tonight. Please help me in welcoming Bill and Wylodean's daughters, Sandra Saxon Bryce and Sherry Saxon Foa. And Bill and Wylodean's son, Steve Saxon, and his wife, Kathy Saxon. Tonight's speaker is also an Oklahoman, maybe not by birth, but she certainly claims this as her home state. Joni L. Kinsey received her PhD from Washington University in St. Louis in 1989 and joined the faculty at the University of Iowa in 1991. Her research specialties include 19th-century landscape painting and art of the American West and Midwest, but her interests range widely, and she's written on a variety of other topics, from 19th-century popular prints to the rise of women artists in the central United States. She is one of the foremost scholars on the celebrated American artist Thomas Moran, and she has authored multiple studies, including Thomas Moran and the Surveying of the American West from 1992, Plain Pictures, Images of the American Prairie from 1996, The Majestic Grand Canyon, 150 Years of Art from 1998, and most recently, Thomas Moran's West, Chromolithography, High Art, and Popular Taste from 2006. In 2014, Professor Kinsey was a Fulbright Fellow in the United Kingdom, working on a new project, Thomas Moran's Britain, Transatlantic Visions of the American Turner. Professor Kinsey is also the curator of the E. Drewlow Collection, a remarkable corpus of 100 paintings, sculptures, works on paper, and personal effects of Eve Drewlow, who bequeathed the collection to the School of Art and Art History in the late 1980s. The title of her lecture tonight is Thomas Moran and Visual Travel in the Gilded Age. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joni L. Kinsey.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure to come back to Oklahoma. I welcome those opportunities for many reasons, but today it's a special treat to be back here at OU. I lectured here many years ago, and it's fun to see both the growth of this collection, this wonderful exhibition that I'm speaking in conjunction with Ticket to Ride, and also some old friends that it's great to see. So thank you all for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here today to speak about aspects of the exhibition, Ticket to Ride, Artists, Designers, and Western Railways. As the exhibition vividly shows, many artists worked with or for the railroads beginning in the middle of the 19th century, developing a new type of corporate artist partnership that had widespread implications not only for the artists and railroad companies, but for American art and culture more generally. Trains are still with us in the United States, but they're the palest shadow of their former glory, and this exhibition, which I really encourage you to see, helps us appreciate how wonderful they once were in so many ways. In their heyday, railroads were truly a revolutionary force, shaping lives and changing culture in a host of ways. They dramatically altered personal travel, engaging people who would otherwise not venture much beyond their own counties to see distant places. They fueled commercial development that shaped national expansion, contributing to a new awareness of national identity at a critical time in American history. They also brought increased artist opportunities to travel to unfamiliar landscapes, along with new patrons and new uses for their images. and they provided new artistic subject matter that had a great range of symbolic potential, representing both a civilizing element that brought definition and structure to a previously uncharted wilderness, and also a foreboding force that threatened the sanctity of nature and its divinely ordained character. Perhaps more subtly, just as recent travel has done, trains affected how people saw the world, transforming fundamental understandings of space, time, and visual aesthetics. From the earliest days of railroad travel, for example, passengers commented on the sequence of pictures that the train windows presented, framing the view almost like paintings. But these pictures moved. Before your eyes, one writer observed, the train unrolls its infinite panorama, a vast succession of charming tableaux of novel surprises. Furthermore, even though early locomotives were pitifully slow by today's standards, moving about 30 miles an hour in the 1830s, that was still 3 times the speed of stagecoaches. And already by the end of the decade, people were writing about the disorienting effect of such startling velocity and the conceptual shrinking of distances that such speed provided. As one writer put it, what changes must now occur in our way of looking at things, on our notions? Even the elementary concepts of time and space have begun to vacillate. Space is killed by the railways, and we are left with time alone. But time was no less transformed, since locomotives increasingly moved with such speed that they outraced the sun. Just as with today's air travel, clocks had to be reset at the conclusion of a long journey across the country. This was unprecedented in human history, but railroad time, as it was called, was such a fact of modern life that by 1888, an international conference was convened in Washington, D.C., dividing the world into the time zones that we know today. Railroads literally altered our relationship to the cosmos. Anyone who traveled by train must have noticed that this way of looking at things was changing. In a most literal way, unlike most other modes of transportation, in a train, only the driver can look out the front. Passengers' angle of vision is restricted to looking out the side windows. There, the speed of travel blurs the nearby scenery, creating disorienting disparities between reality and perception. And just last week, I was in New York State and took the train up the Hudson and paid attention to that. And granted, we're moving faster today in these trains, but still, anything close was literally blurring. It was fun to see. Some travelers likened this effect to a kaleidoscope, saying that they found it difficult to focus on something before it was replaced by something else. As one writer put it, in traveling on most of the railways, the face of nature, the beautiful prospects of hill and dale are lost or distorted to our view. The French writer Victor Hugo was more specific, saying, almost in an anticipation of the art movement we call Impressionism, the flowers by the side of the road are no longer flowers, but flecks, or rather streaks, of red and white. There are no longer any points, and everything becomes a streak. The grain fields are great shocks of yellow hair, fields of alfalfa, long green tresses. The towns, the steeples, and the trees perform a crazy mingling dance on the horizon. And from time to time, a shadow, a shape, a specter appears and disappears with lightning speed behind the window. The earliest American trains, built in the East in the 1830s, were regarded as a harbinger of both civilization and progressive change, and the agent of nature's destruction and its traditional ways of life. As the early 19th century writer Washington Irving wryly put it, if the Garden of Eden were now on earth, they would not hesitate to run a railroad through it. Railroads became the symbol of a new order, what Leo Marx later called the machine in the garden, and their undeniable presence prompted a conceptual sea change in American thought that would dominate at least the next century. As William Gilpin noted in 1845, the American now realizes that progress is God. Recognizing the benefits of railroads, especially the ways they offered new forms of subject matter and sources of patronage, artists and writers began to warm to this new reality in the 1850s. Travel writer Bayard Taylor, for example, noted that with the rapid progress of and wider development of the great locomotive triumphs of the age, the vulgar lament over their introduction is beginning to disappear. Trains began to be depicted in celebratory ways, as we see in the 1852 Home Book of the Picturesque, with its spectacular railroad bridge featured as the title page centerpiece. Trains and their infrastructure offered a new technological aesthetic that could be considered part of the American picturesque, one that emphasized progress and distinction for the still young country. Railroads were quick to capitalize on this appeal, recognizing that pictorial imagery and promotional material could enhance what is today called their market share and corporate identity. Today, we take such visual publicity for granted in the corporate world, but it's important to note that railroads actually pioneered new forms of advertising in what we today call company branding. In an earlier example, this guidebook highlighted the New York and Erie Railway's most extraordinary feature, the Staruka Viaduct in Lanesboro, Pennsylvania, a long stone arch bridge that many people regarded as a monument comparable to ancient Roman aqueducts. Artists such as Jasper Cropsey of the Hudson River School were already inclined to appreciate such classical analogies, and they incorporated this structure, as we see here, into their paintings as a picturesque focal point. Unusual railroad features became tourist attractions, part of the distinctive character of a particular line. Some companies, such as the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, consciously developed these corporate identities through art patronage. The B&O, as it was known, began sponsoring private excursions for artists, writers, and photographers as early as the 1850s, utilizing the images, poems, and stories created from the trips in their promotional material. As one of the writers put it, their job was to prose it here, verse it there, and picturesque it everywhere. One of the new illustrated magazines of the day, Harper's Monthly, as you see here, published an article about the 1858 artistic tour, noting that latterly, steam and the fine arts have scraped acquaintance. The real and the ideal have smoked pipes together. The Iron Horse and Pegasus have trotted side by side in double harness, puffing in unison like a well-trained pair. What will be the result of this conjunction, heaven knows. We believe that it marks the commencement of a new era in human progress. Out west, at the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, the American acquisition of California and adjacent territories had made the United States a truly continental nation. Responding to New York merchant Asa Whitney and Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who is the great uncle of the artist of the same name, you might know of his work from the 1930s, for example, Whitney and Benton proposed linking the Atlantic and Pacific coasts with a great central railway. And Congress, in response, funded 6 surveys across the West in 1853 to determine the best route. These expeditions generated a vast store of information, including hundreds of pictures by some 15 different artists who accompanied the survey teams. Their work illustrated the 12-volume final report, and although most of the artists have remained little known, their contribution to developing ideas about travel and its visual potential was substantial. Many things would slow the completion of the transcontinental line, especially the Civil War in the early 1860s. But in June of 1869, the last spike was driven, opening fast access to the American West to anyone able to afford a ticket. By 1870, it only took a week to travel from New York to San Francisco, and even though the cheapest tickets cost $65, equivalent to about $1,200 today, this was vastly better than the arduous overland trip or the dangerous and similarly costly journey around South America by sea. The images in Ticket to Ride, to some degree, are much more varied than I'm showing you tonight. It's really an incredible exhibition. I want to compliment everyone who was involved with putting it together. Lots of wonderful original work by some artists I've never even heard of. Some of the things I'll show you here tonight as well. It's a terrific and really quite in-depth investigation into the railroad and artistic patronage and collaboration, and as far as I know, is really quite unprecedented. So I'm delighted to see it and really want to, again, congratulate those who were involved. The images in the show and many others, some of which I'll show you tonight, emerged from all of this background I've just discussed as railroads launched a new era of visual travel in America's Gilded Age, the period after the Civil War. Not only were distant and unfamiliar places made more accessible than ever before, but just as important, the new forms of imagery they sponsored revolutionized the act of seeing, as pictures of distant locales appeared in an array of expensive illustrated publications, posters, guidebooks, and other kinds of published materials. And there's just a wealth of this stuff out there. It's fascinating. It's really interesting to look at some of the details once you get into an artist's work. I'll be showing you later the central image of the painting or the image on the right with the Mountain of the Holy Cross, which came from Thomas Moran, which he produced not for the Union Pacific, but for the Denver and Rio Grande Railway. And often we do see the same images appearing across different railroad companies in different kinds of publication. It was an era of a lot of image piracy, and they just sort of frequently borrowed things that they could find in various places. But the wealth of all of this material is really quite extraordinary. Made possible by the mass production of wood pulp paper and new techniques for printing images, this explosion, really, of printed material in mid-century and beyond helped engage people with distant places, whether or not they actually rode the trains. Armchair tourism flourished with a host of beautifully illustrated books that today we would call coffee table books, such as Picturesque America, a 2-volume lavishly produced set, which debuted in the early 1870s with extensive chapters on lots of different locations and lavish pictures in wood engraving on a wide array of scenery. Pictorial atlases, geography books, monthly and weekly magazines and newspapers, and railroad guidebooks and brochures vied for the most evocative images of exotic locales. Until the 1880s, when photographs could be printed via printing presses, printing plates for pictures had to be hand-created through lithography or an arduous technique known as wood engraving, but these could be exceptionally beautiful. As such, these pictures, along with travel itself, shaped perceptions about the world, inspired new understandings of unfamiliar places, and changed ideas about art. Images were no longer the purview of just the wealthy who could afford original paintings and prints. They were as available as the nearest newsstand or bookstore. And in all these ways, this period was an important precursor to our own recent digital revolution that has put unlimited images into everyone's pockets and compressed distances across the world to nanoseconds, opening visions of the world to everyone. The number of guidebooks, posters, timetables, and other illustrated publications grew exponentially as train lines proliferated throughout America in the last decades of the 19th century. These publications and their art have been little studied, but as this exhibition, Ticket to Ride, demonstrates, they offer really an incredibly rich resource for research, revealing how railroad companies were becoming more creative in using images and how artists realized that railroads could facilitate their work in a host of new ways. Many artists benefited from these relationships, and tonight I'm really going to focus on such a few, particularly Thomas Moran, but the exhibition includes many, many, many more. But one of the more interesting examples is Thomas Moran, the first artist to visit the Yellowstone and Grand Canyon regions in the early 1870s. Both a painter in oil and watercolors and a prolific illustrator, Moran had a long career of working with railroads in a variety of media. After his formative years in Philadelphia, during which he created a number of landscapes that include railroads, such as this view from 1869 in the guidebook to Westchester and Philadelphia. Moran traveled west for the first time with a federal survey, the first federal survey to Yellowstone, which was then a relatively unknown region, or little known. At the time, the Northern Pacific Railroad was building its transcontinental line across the northern prairies from St. Paul to Puget Sound, and company officials were eager for tourist attractions along their route. Anxious for more than written descriptions of such sites, or at least potential sites, the NPRR director, Jay Cook, arranged for and subsidized Moran's trip to Yellowstone, and in return, the artist produced a set of 16 watercolors for him, one of which is on the far right center, and I'll show you in a moment the brochure the railroad company used for a promotional brochure. Shortly after the 1871 survey returned east, the Northern Pacific spearheaded the effort to make Yellowstone the first national park. And after the legislation passed in the spring of 1872, the company identified itself for the next half century as the Yellowstone Park Line, using views that Moran originated in many of their advertisements. And in addition to this one, and I've got another couple coming up later, there's a wonderful big poster from the Northern Pacific downstairs, a big vertical Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone scene with the Yellowstone Park Line right across the bottom. The railroad's role in helping establish the first national park and in making other sites that later became national parks known is certainly very significant, but art's shaping of expectations about tourist attractions is no less so. In this instance, Yellowstone was so unlike anything anyone in the East had ever seen that only visual images could really convey the area's distinctiveness. And the pictures really transformed the way Yellowstone was regarded. Before Moran and William Henry Jackson, the photographer on the expedition's view of the area were made available, for example, many of the features in Yellowstone were described as eerie and satanic. And some of the place names there still reflect this. Yellowstone, for example, has the Devil's Slide and the Witch's Cauldron, Hellfire Roaring River, and the Firehole Basin. These names are certainly intriguing, but they aren't exactly the kind of places that attract visitors to a park. After all, who wants to take a vacation to hell? But through the railroad's lobbying process, and especially with Moran's extraordinary colored views to reinforce the transition, Yellowstone's identity began to shift to Wonderland, a word that had special magic in the early 1870s since Lewis Carroll's book, Alice in Wonderland, was an international sensation at the time. Yellowstone was called Wonderland in most subsequent promotional writing and advertising, especially in those by the Northern Pacific Railroad, which became the primary route to the park by 1883. It was nothing less than a shrewd publicity campaign that had enormous effect, and Thomas Moran's views were a key part of the transformation. Railroad publicity and the visual images they sponsored not only fueled tourism, but in many cases also helped shape the development of the actual sites, especially in regard to scenic overlooks that offered the best view of a particular feature. Artist portrayals created expectations for viewpoints as visitors came to feel that they hadn't really seen the best of an area until they had stood on the spot where a painting or a photograph or a postcard was made. This was especially true at what is now known as Artist Point at the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, not to be confused with the Grand Canyon in Arizona. This is the Big Canyon in Yellowstone. This is a location that offers a panoramic view of the subject of Moran's first great painting, a 7 by 12-foot canvas that is today in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It was purchased shortly after its completion, essentially as a commemoration of the new national park in the spring of 1872 by Congress for $10,000 to hang in the U.S. Capitol building. It was the first landscape painting by an American artist to be so honored, and it would be followed in a couple of years by a similarly large, identical-sized painting of the Arizona Grand Canyon that Moran produced in 1873, also purchased for $10,000 by Congress, and the two hung in the U.S. Capitol until 1952, when the Senate Press Corps needed that space and they moved the pictures to the Smithsonian. Pictures such as this seemed, in some ways you might say, like the proverbial mountain and Mohammed, bringing places to the people in yet another form of visual travel. Shaping understandings of the extent and variety of this great continent, pictures brought a new sense of national identity, one that incorporated the natural world in all of its vastness. Moran went back to Yellowstone in 1892 and produced yet another massive picture, this one 10 by 14 feet, of the same Yellowstone Canyon, a little bit more impressionistic, and that too is today in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. But it was picked up by the Northern Pacific Railroad at the end of the century and the early years of the 20th century. Here you see the painting on the upper right. It's not a chromolithograph, I'll explain that term in a moment, but a kind of photogravure version of it over here on the right, and then a poster version produced for the Northern Pacific Railroad by this St. Paul publishing company, Brown and Bigelow. And this is the horizontal version of the one that I just described that's down in the gallery with the vertical orientation. You'll take a look. It looks rather similar, just sort of sliced in the middle. This term chromolithography that I just described was the state-of-the-art color reproduction method of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. It was pretty well outmoded by photography methods of printing plates photographically produced in the 80s and 90s, and certainly by 1900. But another interesting project that Moran was involved with took place in the early 1870s in conjunction with this chromolithography publishing house, Lewis Prang and Company of Boston. And Prang got word of the new national park and all of the excitement about it, and this really didn't have anything to do with railroads, but I do think this is part of the way in which people were exposed to imagery, and it inspired them towards interest in traveling. This particular set of chromos was rather special. It was clearly a very expensive undertaking on Prang's part. He was anxious to capitalize on the fame of the new national park and other areas of the West, and he devoted a tremendous amount of his company's effort into the process and the final result, which is a big portfolio of mounted color prints that I will demonstrate the process here in a moment. They sold as a set for, at the time, $60, which was about $1,000 today, so not cheap by any means. It was marketed to libraries and high-end collectors, and today is regarded as some of the finest examples of chromolithography ever produced. So to explain the technique, lithography is a printing technique that even today artists use. It's done on a very finely grained limestone block, and essentially it operates on the principle that oil and water don't mix. You draw on this very fine limestone surface with a greased base medium, whether a grease pencil or a grease oily-based ink, and create your image. And then there's a couple of steps in the process, but essentially water is used to dampen the surface, and the oily image rejects the water. The empty limestone soaks up the water, and then the surface is inked with an oily ink so that the image collects that ink, but the wet, damp surfaces of the stone repel it, and then paper is pressed to the stone, and you get this remarkably faithful image. But that's just one color, and in order to get multiple colors, in this period, they had to separate out the colors in a very arduous sort of way. Today, what's called four-color, full-color printing processes only use 4 colors of ink. It's so sophisticated, it's all done with filters on cameras. But in this era, it was all hand-drawn, and every single color in the final full-color image had to be completely hand-drawn. So just the reds in one stone, just the yellows in another, just the blues in another. And real specialists sat there with the original color image in front of them and had to literally make up, well, what is just the yellow in that image? Then it all had to be absolutely perfectly aligned, and each piece of paper went over every single stone with all of the different colors. So Prang, to explain this process, produced what he called progressive proof books. There you see the original drawing. What he was working from is that final image. And then the specialist, called a chromiste, would literally, again, by hand, create a separate stone for every color, and these books showed the building of the colors. So on one page, you see just the single color, and then you see the aggregate building of the colors as you turn the pages on the right sides of the book. So this particular image, in its final version, took 44 stones. There you see the original painting on the right and the chromolithograph on the left. It's not nearly as blue and rich as the original painting, but I think a lot of that has to do with fading over time. In their really pristine versions, these are very faithful to the originals. And just to demonstrate, this special set that Moran produced for Louis Prang was 15 beautifully colored watercolors, from which Prang produced this set of really intensely colored final prints, which really were, as I said, regarded as the best examples of chromolithography ever produced. The railroads would get into the chromolithography business, and we'll be looking at a couple of those in a moment, and there is at least one, maybe more, downstairs. I certainly remember one, which I'll be showing you momentarily. So it's a fascinating process, and one that I think really is rather remarkable when you understand how arduous it was to create. By the mid-1870s, some eastern railroads were sufficiently established that they published illustrated histories of their lines. Moran contributed several images to these, including the Pennsylvania Railroad, issued in 1875, which included 12 of his wood engravings. And there was a brisk market for guidebooks published by private publishers, such as Henry Williams' Pacific Tourist, illustrated transcontinental tourist guide from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that appeared in 1876 with 11 plates by Moran. This was an impressive book that included the work of over 40 artists, engravers, and correspondents who made some 30 transcontinental trips to gather the most accurate and current information. When completed, the book was regarded as the most elaborate and handsomest guidebook in America. 1881 was a special time for Moran's work. Back east, the Baltimore and Ohio line had continued to identify itself as the picturesque B&O, and that year it commissioned Moran, writer J.G. Pangborn, and a man named John Karst, known as Applejack Karst, who was an engraver, to travel its route in a special private train to produce a deluxe guidebook, which ended up being lavishly illustrated with 72 illustrations by Moran. Immediately after that trip, Moran and the engraver Karst traveled to Colorado, where they took a similar excursion in a special train that had a viewing platform at the back, along with the photographer William Henry Jackson and writer Ernest Ingersoll on the route of the Denver and Rio Grande Railway through the Rocky Mountains. The trip was organized by the vice president of the DNRG, William Bell, who had recently purchased Moran's 5-by-7-foot painting, The Mountain of the Holy Cross, which is today in Los Angeles at the Autry Museum. And Bell was anxious to promote his line with this image and others. The trip had rich results, including an article and a book by Ingersoll, a number of illustrated guidebooks, timetables, advertisements, and books of poetry for rail travelers that you could read on the train. Moran and Jackson made dozens of new images and established a lifelong relationship with Bell, who subsequently commissioned Jackson to become the principal photographer for the DNRG Railway. Moran's view of the Mountain of the Holy Cross became almost a logo for the DNRG, which included it in many different publications. and in this ad, advertised it as nature's emblem of Christianity, one of many wondrous views seen from the trains, even though this was essentially untrue. Moran himself had altered the perspective of that mountain, giving the face of it a scenic valley, sort of broad view up the mountain. In reality, the mountain really kind of hides. It's really turned away from the valley, and he just sort of turned it back around. You can now get a distant view of it, as you see there. Just off Highway 70 between Copper Mountain and Breckenridge, look for Shrine Pass Road. And it's quite a place, really quite an extraordinary place. But it became essentially the, sort of, like I said, logo of the DNRG. Thomas Moran first visited the Grand Canyon in Arizona in 1873 with John Wesley Powell's Federal Survey of the region, but it was not until 1901 that the remote area could be reached by train. Even before its line was complete, however, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, better known usually as the Santa Fe, began shaping the site as a tourist attraction through art. In 1892, it commissioned Moran to return to the canyon and create a painting that could be reproduced as a large chromolithograph, framed and hung in depots throughout its line. And yes, this chromolithograph, which is down here, this is the original painting from which it was made, which is today in the Philadelphia Museum. The chromo is in the exhibition, and I'll show you in a moment yet another one as well. This oil, called the Grand Canyon from Hermit Rim Road, remained in the company's collection until quite recently, and until really almost his death in 1926. Moran started traveling the Santa Fe line out to the Grand Canyon almost annually, usually trading a painting or two to the company in exchange for his rail fare and his lodging at the Rimside El Tovar Hotel. Another painting they commissioned and was made into a large chromolithograph is here, the Grand Canyon from Hermit Rim Road, which remained in the collection until quite recently. Today you can buy these big chromos, both sometimes on eBay, but there's an uncirculated set that's being handled out of the Zeppelin Lambert Gallery in Santa Fe, completely uncirculated, that were in the company's archives until the company merged with the Burlington Northern fairly recently. Moran became such a fixture at the Grand Canyon through these years of the early 20th century that he became something of a tourist attraction himself, featured prominently in Santa Fe advertisements around 1906. As the company's advertising agent remarked, the fact that he goes there steadily is of great advertising value, and he constantly talks Grand Canyon when he's away from there. Well, the success of this relationship sort of pioneered an innovative program in which the Santa Fe Railway offered travel and lodging to artists in exchange for paintings that they produced at the Grand Canyon. Dozens of artists, including many that are now known as the Taos School of Painters and the Santa Fe School, funded their travels to and their work in the Southwest in this way. And the Santa Fe Company acquired a substantial collection that it used to decorate its corporate headquarters, hotels, and depots along its route, to adorn advertising from guidebooks and calendars to posters and brochures. Here's some more of those, and several of these are in the exhibition here today. At the same time, through its promotional material, the Santa Fe Railway almost single-handedly turned the Grand Canyon into one of the top tourist destinations in the world. Many other railroads also sponsored artists, many of whose names were never acknowledged, to promote the attractions of their lines, especially after 1900. And with the growth of the national park system, many of the areas they highlighted were of national parks. The Great Northern, for example, focused especially on Glacier National Park, which it touted as America's Switzerland. And over the course of its first few decades, it funded an array of art by artists that are beautifully included in the exhibition, including Abby Williams Hill over here on the right, John Frary, there's several of those in the show. Vinold Rice here, who had a school up at Glacier in the summertime that he taught artists, and also Charles Russell. And I brought in, I thought this was kind of an interesting, sorry it's a bit fuzzy, but it's a train car from the 1950s that is clearly decorated with what are probably reproductions of Charles Russell's paintings. On every Great Northern Railway brochure and billboards were 3 words: "See America First." That slogan originated in 1906 at a conference in Utah that sought to develop tourism throughout the West. Motivated especially by financial rewards for Western states and companies, the initiative also touted this project as a patriotic mission, seeking to make, quote, better citizens of the tens of thousands of Americans who are now living in ignorance of their own land, and also to preach the gospel of a better known America, unquote. The See America First League recognized that scenery was the program's most valuable asset, and they advertised that American landscape images should be made widely available so that the public could appreciate what they called the volume of Niagara, the height of Mount McKinley, and the vastness of the Grand Canyon. The railroads were happy to oblige, and they redoubled their promotional efforts, moving into the vivid new possibilities of color reproduction in new forms, not chromolithography, that early 20th century printing technologies provided. The Southern Pacific Railroad, for example, promoted Yosemite, Kings Canyon, Sequoia, and Crater Lake national parks with bright graphic materials, and many of these national parks in some measure owe their existence to the lobbying efforts of these railroads. The Southern Pacific also, I think, intriguingly touted the size of the great sequoia trees in California, comparing them to the size of the new skyscrapers adorning the Manhattan skyline, the Flatiron Building here from 1903, I believe it was. And 2, the Southern Pacific Railway had already started a magazine, Sunset, in 1898, which became not only an advertising vehicle for its line and all of the wonders along it, but also a source of information about the West. This publication is still in production today. Over the course of its early years, Sunset, and there's many copies down in the exhibition, Sunset magazine fostered a new aesthetic of a golden West, one that glistened with promise and exotic allure, especially appealing to a modernist sensibility as seen through the works of artists such as Maynard Dixon, who did many covers for the publication in the early decades of the 20th century. Lest we think all of this is in the past, Amtrak today still does this a little bit, and I brought in just one view of a recent vintage by J. Craig Thorpe, Wilderness Threshold from 2000, commissioned by Amtrak, another Glacier National Park scene. We all may be more attracted to the grand landscapes that the railroads helped foster than their less glamorous guidebooks and posters, but these works are all related, and that the seemingly modest imagery of the published railroad ephemera, the stuff that doesn't seem to last, is important since it reached more viewers than the big paintings and inspired them to tour the vast American landscape for themselves. The images reveal the richness of visual travel, whether in person, observing the varieties of unfamiliar locales, or via images that others have created for us. The railroads were among the early innovators of a striking assemblage of media that opened a world of new places to countless audiences. They were responsible for a wealth of art, paintings, prints, and published materials that today we regard as some of the most notable and certainly interesting images in American art. Railroads transformed our relationship to time, space, and place, helping us see anew and craft a sense of national and regional identity that, although changed, is still with us today. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions. How many of you have seen that exhibition? It certainly includes a lot more than I addressed tonight, so I really encourage you to spend some time, read those rich labels and wall texts, and look closely at just an incredible wealth of images down there, from paintings and pastels to drawings and publications. On a train? Oh, I don't know. Sorry. Uh-huh. You know why? He's saying that it changed from this shape to straight because, yeah. Uh-huh, uh-huh. Boy, the mechanics of locomotives is beyond my purview. Although it does have an aesthetic dimension because it changed the shape of it, I guess you could say. Thank you. Yes? Oh, certainly I know more about the national park versions of those than others, but there's several interesting examples. But yeah, in some of these national parks where the railroad was really the avenue, not only in, but responsible for the development of those national parks. Yellowstone was the Northern Pacific's, Santa Fe's was the Grand Canyon, Great Northern's was Glacier, and Southern Pacific, like I said, did Yosemite and Crater Lake and others. They almost all built hotels, sometimes really lavish, enormous ones. The Old Faithful Inn, the largest log cabin in the world, is in Yellowstone. That was a Northern Pacific hotel. El Tovar at rimside of the Grand Canyon was a Santa Fe hotel. Glacier National Park has several hotels that they built. And certainly among the more distinctive hotel programs, you might say, was the Santa Fe's, and some of you I know surely have heard of the Harvey Girls and the Harvey restaurants, old Judy Garland movie, The Harvey Girls. Fred Harvey and then his son Ford Harvey were kind of the associated company, the Harvey Company, to the Santa Fe Railway. They were the hospitality arm of the Santa Fe Railway. And until the Santa Fe really pioneered this, trains would stop and you might get off and have a really bad sandwich or something, but the Fred Harvey Company started setting up really quite good restaurants in their depots where they knew when the train was arriving. They had hot dinners on china plates with nicely dressed waitresses to serve the passengers as they got off the train. They became widely known for good food, good service, and really just sort of excellence all around. They also then started being the commissary really in the hotels for the Santa Fe Railway, and it became one of the really distinctive characteristics of riding the Santa Fe line was to stop at the Harvey hotels. La Fonda Hotel in Santa Fe was a Harvey hotel, and it's a wonderfully rich history. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, the railways were very active in getting some of this infrastructure in place for hospitality and tourism.
Joni, would you say just another word about Moran's propensity to change up the landscapes for a better view?
Sure. Let me go back and give a little, I don't have all the details here, but I could talk about it certainly, not only with the Mountain of the Holy Cross, but the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. You can see the actual view, not in full display, but behind there, the great painting, which was widely touted upon its debut in the East as being absolutely accurate. He even had the geologist that he'd gone to Yellowstone with there to testify to its accuracy. But upon close inspection, the view from Artist's Point looks very different in several important ways. It's a much more rugged valley. The sloping sides of the painting are nowhere in evidence in the actual site. certainly the kind of cliffs on the far right, those white kind of peaks, are there, but they're much less domineering in actuality. And two, this foreground and the tree on the left were really completely fabricated and invented for the purposes of composing the picture. And so in my early investigations of Moran, I sat with photographs and then I visited the site and looked at the painting and thought, now how did he get from this to that? And I started looking at both his sketches from the trip in 1871, which he did around the canyon from many different points of view, and also the photographs that were taken alongside him by William Henry Jackson. And as it turned out, he had those photographs back in the East where he was painting this massive picture and clearly was composing a composite view that resulted in this final version that, upon first glance, yeah, it looks just like the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone until you really start examining it. The tree on the left, he was very fond of that tree. He imported it from a sketch that he made in the Borghese Gardens in Rome in 1867, and he used it in multiple Western paintings, as if it's a Douglas fir or something out west. So that was an interesting example of that. In the end, what we're looking at here in the final painting is mostly composed of views taken by Jackson. He's looking at these photographs back east, and if you really look at those photographs, the main thing that's missing in them, they all have that lovely sloping valley, but the waterfall is not there. And upon real close inspection, the water is not flowing towards you, it's flowing away from you. Those photographs were taken from the top of the falls looking down the canyon. Here we're down the canyon looking upriver, and Moran's just sort of inverted the view. This was not unusual for a lot of artists. In fact, it was pretty standard practice, using, in particular, the theories of an aesthetician, an aesthetic theorist, John Ruskin, who was a British writer and wrote a lot of important books for artists of this period, in which Ruskin said, go out in nature and sketch as faithfully as possible. He said, not a stick to be moved, not a stone to be turned, and bring back these mirrors of nature. But then, in the studio, let what he called a veil pass between you and that memory and recompose these pictures into what he called the grand impression. He wasn't talking about impressionism, he's talking about the way that place seemed. And that's what we have in this final picture.
We have time for one more question. Any takers? Oh, Jack.
I don't have a question, but rather a compliment. I just wanted to thank you. It was very erudite and a lot of fun, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate being here more than I can tell you. I enjoyed this very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Kinsey. Thank you to the Saxon family and the endowment that makes this lecture possible, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight.